Princess Elizabeth entered the world in 1533 with a blood-red serpent snaking across her shoulder, a mark so feared they called it the devil's signature. Servants refused to touch her, priests whispered of demonic bloodlines. But the cursed child didn't just survive, she ruled. And when she revealed the mark at her coronation, thunder split the sky. What followed was a reign of impossible victories, prophetic visions, and a kingdom that feared her as much as they adored her. Like, if you believe in cursed royalty, comment if the mark was divine or damned, and subscribe to witness how a child born feared became empress by fire and fate. The midwife's scream pierced through the royal chambers like a blade through silk, her trembling hands recoiling from the newborn child as if she had touched molten iron. In the flickering candlelight of that September night in 1533, what should have been cries of celebration became whispers of horror, for the infant who would one day rule an empire bore upon her tiny body what the superstitious called the devil's own signature. The mark stretched across her delicate skin like a crimson wine stain, a birthmark so vivid and unusual that even the court physicians crossed themselves in fear. Some said it resembled a serpent coiled around her shoulder. Others swore they could see the outline of cloven hooves dancing across her back. The wet nurses refused to touch her, the servants crossed themselves when she passed, and even her own mother, the empress, would sometimes gaze upon her daughter with eyes filled not with maternal love, but with barely concealed terror. Yet this was no ordinary child marked by fate's cruel hand. This was Elizabeth of Russia, born into a world that would both worship and fear her, destined to become one of history's most powerful rulers, despite carrying what her enemies would forever call the devil's own seal upon her flesh. The irony was as sharp as winter wind cutting through the Russian steppes. The child they believed cursed would grow to command the largest empire on earth, her supposed mark of damnation becoming the very symbol of her divine right to rule. The royal court buzzed with whispered prophecies and midnight consultations with Orthodox priests who spoke in hushed tones about demonic bloodlines and cursed dynasties. Some claimed the mark grew darker with each passing month, feeding on the child's growing power like a parasite of supernatural origin. Others insisted they could see it pulse with its own unholy rhythm, matching the beat of a heart that perhaps belonged not to this world, but to something far more sinister lurking in the shadows between heaven and hell. As young Elizabeth grew from infant to child, the mark became her constant companion and her deepest shame. She would spend hours before mirrors, trying desperately to scrub away what God or the devil had permanently etched into her very being. The other children of the court were forbidden to play with her, their parents fearing that whatever dark force had claimed the princess might spread like plague through innocent touch. She learned to dress in high-necked gowns and long sleeves, to move through palace corridors like a ghost, always hiding, always aware that beneath her royal silks lay the evidence of her supernatural burden. The mark seemed to respond to her emotions, growing more vivid when she was angry, fading to an almost invisible pink when she laughed, though laughter became increasingly rare in a childhood spent under the shadow of whispered curses and fearful glances. Court painters refused to capture her true likeness, instead creating sanitized portraits that bore no resemblance to the marked child who posed for them. Even her official coronation portraits would later be altered, the devil's mark carefully painted over with flesh tones and royal regalia, as if art could undo what nature had so boldly declared. The Orthodox Church found itself torn between duty and superstition. How could they anoint as God's chosen ruler a child who bore what appeared to be Satan's own signature? Secret councils were held in monastery chambers, lit only by oil lamps, where aged bishops debated whether the mark was a test of faith, a punishment for ancestral sins, or something far more dangerous, a sign that the throne of Russia was destined to fall under demonic influence. Yet as Elizabeth matured, something extraordinary began to emerge from behind the veil of her supernatural stigma. The same fierce intelligence that her detractors claimed came from hellish sources proved to be sharper than any blade forged in mortal fire. She could speak 7 languages by age 12, could outmaneuver grown men in political discourse by 15, and possessed an intuitive understanding of power dynamics that seemed to transcend human learning. Whether this brilliance sprang from divine gift or infernal bargain, none could deny its devastating effectiveness. The young princess learned to weaponize her own curse, using the fear it inspired as a tool of political control. Enemies who expected to face a weak, marked child instead encountered a brilliant strategist who had spent her entire life studying human nature from the unique perspective of one treated as an outsider. She understood fear because she had lived with it, understood prejudice because she had endured it, and understood power because she had been denied it for so long. When revolution came to the Russian court, when her half-nephew Ivan VI was deposed and the throne lay vacant, Elizabeth struck with the precision of a serpent, perhaps fitting, given what some claimed to see writhing across her marked skin. The military officers who had once crossed themselves in her presence now knelt before her, recognizing that the devil's mark they had feared might actually be the sign of a ruler touched by something beyond mortal comprehension. The coronation ceremony itself became a masterpiece of political theater and religious contradiction. As the heavy crown of Russia was placed upon her head, Elizabeth deliberately wore a gown that exposed her marked shoulder, transforming her lifelong shame into a symbol of divine selection. If God had allowed her to reach this moment, despite her supernatural burden, she declared, then perhaps the mark was not a curse but a blessing, a sign that she had been chosen to bear burdens that ordinary mortals could not endure. The crowd that witnessed her coronation fell silent as the golden crown caught the light streaming through cathedral windows, illuminating both her regal beauty and the vivid mark that had defined her existence. In that moment of profound symbolism, the devil's mark and the divine crown existed in perfect, impossible harmony, a living contradiction that would define her reign and challenge every assumption about good and evil, curse and blessing, damnation and salvation. From that day forward, Elizabeth ruled with the authority of one who had already survived her worst enemy, herself. The mark that had once been hidden beneath silk and shame became her signature, her proof that she could transform any weakness into strength, any curse into crown. Foreign ambassadors would later write of their first audiences with the Empress, describing how the infamous mark seemed to glow with its own inner light when she spoke of matters of state, as if drawing power from some source beyond human understanding. Her enemies learned to fear not just her political acumen, but the supernatural aura that surrounded her very presence. Stories spread throughout Europe of the Russian Empress, who bore the devil's own mark, yet ruled with divine authority, who had somehow bridged the gap between heaven and hell to claim earthly power. Some whispered that she had made an actual pact with dark forces, trading her soul for temporal dominion. Others insisted that she was a test sent by God to challenge humanity's understanding of good and evil. The truth, as Elizabeth herself understood it, was perhaps more complex and more human than either explanation could capture. The mark that had shaped her childhood had taught her that appearance and reality were often opposing forces, that strength could emerge from shame, and that the very thing that makes you different might be the thing that makes you powerful. She had learned to read human nature with the sharp insight of one who had spent her life being judged, misunderstood, and feared. Under her rule, Russia expanded its borders and influence with unprecedented success, as if the empire itself was fed by the same mysterious energy that seemed to pulse through her marked skin. Military victories came with startling regularity. Diplomatic negotiations fell in her favor with supernatural consistency, and the Russian court became the most feared and respected in all of Europe. Whether this success sprang from brilliant strategy, divine blessing, or something darker, none could deny its reality. The winter of 1742 brought with it more than snow and bitter cold. It brought the first real test of Elizabeth's supernatural authority. A coalition of European powers, threatened by Russia's growing influence, decided to test whether the marked empress was truly protected by otherworldly forces or merely benefiting from fortunate circumstances. They launched a coordinated attack on 3 fronts, expecting to overwhelm the Russian military and expose Elizabeth as nothing more than a mortal woman with an unusual birthmark. What they encountered instead defied all military logic and natural law. Russian forces seemed to move with preternatural coordination, anticipating enemy strategies with impossible accuracy. Soldiers reported that in the heat of battle, they could swear they saw their empress's mark glowing like a beacon through the smoke and chaos, even when she was hundreds of miles away in St. Petersburg. Weather patterns shifted in Russia's favor with such consistent timing that enemy generals began to whisper about supernatural intervention. The most dramatic moment came during the Battle of Friedberg, where Russian forces were vastly outnumbered and facing certain defeat. Witnesses on both sides later swore that as the sun began to set, a strange crimson light appeared on the horizon. Not the natural red of sunset, but something deeper, more intense, that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As this light grew stronger, the Russian soldiers seemed to find new strength, fighting with desperate courage that turned the tide of battle in ways that military historians still struggle to explain. Elizabeth herself was in her palace during this battle, but servants reported that she spent the entire day in her private chambers, pacing before mirrors, her famous mark glowing so brightly that it could be seen through her clothing. When news of the impossible victory arrived, she collapsed from exhaustion, as if whatever force had aided her armies had drained something essential from her own being. The mark, which had burned with supernatural fire during the battle, faded to barely visible pink, remaining dim for weeks as she recovered. This pattern would repeat throughout her reign, moments of crisis where Elizabeth's mark would blaze with otherworldly intensity, corresponding with inexplicable turns of fortune for the Russian Empire. Her enemies began to fear not just her political cunning, but the possibility that she had access to powers beyond mortal understanding. Assassination attempts failed with such regularity that would-be killers started to believe she was protected by supernatural forces. The most famous of these attempts occurred in 1744, when a coalition of disgruntled nobles hired an assassin known throughout Europe for his skill with poison. He gained access to Elizabeth's private dining chamber and successfully introduced a lethal dose of arsenic into her wine. The poison was tasteless, odorless, and had never failed to kill its intended target within hours. Elizabeth drank the wine without hesitation, seemingly unaware of its deadly contents. Hours passed. Then days. The assassin waited in hiding for news of the Empress's death, but instead heard reports of her attending court functions, making political decisions, and showing no signs of illness whatsoever. When he was finally captured and tortured for information, he swore that he had used enough poison to kill a dozen people, but that perhaps the devil protects his own. Elizabeth, when informed of the attempt, merely smiled and remarked that perhaps her mark came with more benefits than curses. The incident sparked new rumors about the true nature of Elizabeth's supernatural connection. Some claimed she was immortal, protected by dark forces from any mortal harm. Others insisted that she had made a bargain with otherworldly powers, trading something precious for protection and power. The most disturbing theory, whispered in the darkest corners of European courts, suggested that Elizabeth was not entirely human, that whatever had marked her at birth had also transformed her into something beyond the normal limitations of flesh and blood. Religious authorities throughout Orthodox Christianity found themselves facing an unprecedented theological crisis. How could they reconcile their duty to support the divinely appointed ruler with growing evidence that her power might spring from decidedly non-divine sources? Secret theological debates raged in monasteries from Moscow to Constantinople, with scholars poring over ancient texts seeking precedent for a ruler who bore supernatural marks, yet governed with apparent divine blessing. The answer came from an unlikely source, an ancient manuscript discovered in the deepest vaults of the Hagia Sophia, written in a mixture of Greek and Old Church Slavonic that few scholars could decipher. The text spoke of chosen vessels, individuals marked by forces beyond good and evil, to serve as bridges between the mortal and immortal realms. According to this cryptic document, such beings were neither blessed nor cursed, but something far more complex, living embodiments of divine paradox, existing to test humanity's understanding of absolute categories. Elizabeth herself began to embrace this interpretation, seeing her mark not as a sign of damnation or salvation, but as evidence of her unique role in the cosmic order. She commissioned court theologians to develop a new understanding of divine selection that could accommodate supernatural marking, without requiring her to be either saint or demon. The resulting theological framework suggested that God sometimes chose unusual vessels for divine will, marking them in ways that would test the faith and understanding of those around them. This theological revolution had profound political implications. Elizabeth was no longer the cursed child who had somehow achieved power despite supernatural stigma, nor was she the demonic ruler who had bargained with dark forces for earthly dominion. Instead, she became something unprecedented in European monarchy, a ruler whose very existence challenged traditional categories and demanded new forms of understanding and allegiance. The transformation of her public image from cursed child to divine paradox coincided with the most successful period of her reign, Russian territory expanded at an unprecedented rate, with military victories that seemed to defy strategic logic. The economy flourished under policies that Elizabeth claimed came to her in dreams, where she received guidance from sources she described only as voices that speak in colors rather than words. Cultural achievements reached new heights, with art and literature that seemed to capture something transcendent about the human experience. Foreign diplomats who came to negotiate with Elizabeth reported experiences that challenged their understanding of normal human interaction. Many described feeling as though they were in the presence of something more than mortal, not in a threatening way, but in a manner that expanded their conception of what was possible. Her marked skin seemed to pulse with subtle light during intense negotiations, and several ambassadors claimed they could feel an electric sensation in the air when she spoke about matters of great importance. The most detailed account comes from the French ambassador, who wrote in his private diary about a midnight audience with the Empress in 1746. He described entering her private study to find her standing before a window, moonlight illuminating her famous mark so clearly that it seemed to be made of liquid fire rather than mortal flesh. When she turned to face him, he wrote, her eyes reflected that same otherworldly light, and he found himself sharing diplomatic secrets he had never intended to reveal, as if some force beyond his control was drawing truth from his lips. Elizabeth's court became a place where the impossible seemed routine, where political victories arrived with supernatural timing, and where the Empress herself moved through palace corridors like a living bridge between the mortal and divine realms. Servants learned to anticipate her needs through subtle changes in the intensity of her mark, which seemed to darken when she was displeased and brighten when she was content. The mark had become not just her identifying characteristic, but a barometer of the empire's spiritual health. The most extraordinary manifestation of Elizabeth's supernatural connection occurred during the Great Famine of 1748, when crop failures threatened to starve millions of Russian peasants. Traditional relief efforts were proving inadequate, and social unrest was beginning to threaten the stability of the empire. Elizabeth retreated to her private chambers for 3 days and nights, emerging only to announce that she had received divine guidance about how to address the crisis. What followed defied agricultural science and natural law. Elizabeth ordered her administrators to plant winter wheat in frozen ground, using seed stocks that agricultural experts insisted were too old to germinate. She claimed that her marked skin had grown warm whenever she touched certain seeds, indicating which ones would grow despite impossible conditions. Skeptical but desperate, her administrators followed these bizarre instructions. The results stunned everyone involved. Seeds that should have rotted in frozen earth not only germinated, but grew with unnatural speed and vigor. Crops that normally required months to mature were ready for harvest in weeks. The grain that grew from Elizabeth's supernaturally selected seeds proved more nutritious than normal wheat, capable of sustaining families on smaller portions than usual. The famine ended not gradually but almost overnight, as if the laws of nature had bent to accommodate the marked empress's will. Scientists and theologians alike struggled to explain what had occurred. Agricultural experts could find no natural explanation for crops that grew in conditions that should have killed them. Religious authorities debated whether they had witnessed a miracle or something more ambiguous, a demonstration of power that transcended normal categories of divine and demonic intervention. Elizabeth herself offered no explanation beyond her claim that the mark on her skin had guided her to the right choices, serving as a conduit for knowledge that existed beyond normal human understanding. The success of the supernatural harvest established Elizabeth's reputation not just as a skilled ruler, but as someone who possessed access to knowledge and power that existed beyond the mortal realm. Peasants began to worship her as a living saint, while intellectuals debated whether they were witnessing the emergence of a new form of divine appointment. The mark that had once been her shame became the symbol of her empire's prosperity, representing a form of leadership that transcended normal political categories. European courts found themselves forced to reconsider their understanding of legitimate authority in light of Elizabeth's continued success. Traditional concepts of divine right assumed that God worked through normal human vessels, blessing their decisions and guiding their actions through prayer and contemplation. Elizabeth's rule suggested something far more direct and mysterious, a form of divine communication that bypassed normal religious channels and manifested through supernatural physical signs. The theological implications were staggering. If Elizabeth's mark truly served as a conduit for divine will, what did that suggest about the nature of God's relationship with temporal power? If supernatural success could spring from demonic sources, how could the faithful distinguish between divine blessing and infernal deception? These questions sparked religious debates that would continue long after Elizabeth's death, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between heaven, hell, and earthly authority. Elizabeth herself seemed to grow more powerful and mysterious with each passing year. The mark that had defined her childhood evolved into something that pulsed with visible energy during moments of crisis or decision. Court artists who attempted to capture her likeness found that their paintings somehow failed to dry properly when they tried to depict the mark accurately, as if some force was preventing permanent representation of its true appearance. The most ambitious attempt to document Elizabeth's supernatural characteristics came from a secret scientific expedition sponsored by the French Academy of Sciences in 1751. Disguised as a cultural exchange, the expedition brought the most advanced measuring instruments of the age to Elizabeth's court, hoping to determine whether her mark exhibited properties that defied natural law. The results of their investigation were so disturbing that the official report was classified and hidden in the Academy's archives, with copies destroyed and the scientists sworn to secrecy. According to fragments that survived in private correspondence, the investigators discovered that Elizabeth's mark exhibited several properties that should have been impossible. The skin temperature in the marked area fluctuated independently of her body temperature, sometimes becoming cold enough to frost over while the rest of her body remained warm. The mark appeared to emit a form of light that was visible to some observers, but not others, with no apparent correlation between visual acuity and the ability to perceive this phenomenon. Most disturbing of all, the investigators claimed to have detected what they described as electromagnetic anomalies centered on the marked area. Their primitive instruments registered energy fluctuations that seemed to correlate with Elizabeth's emotional state and political decisions. During a particularly intense diplomatic negotiation that the scientists were allowed to observe, their instruments detected energy readings that were off the scale of measurement, as if some form of power was flowing through the marked empress that existed beyond current scientific understanding. The lead investigator, Dr. François Moreau, wrote in his encrypted personal journal that he believed Elizabeth represented something unprecedented in human history, a being who served as a living conduit between normal reality and forces that existed beyond mortal comprehension. He theorized that her mark was not merely a birthmark, but a kind of supernatural organ that allowed her to perceive and manipulate aspects of reality that remained invisible to normal human consciousness. These scientific observations aligned with reports from Elizabeth's closest advisors, who described increasingly surreal experiences in her presence. Ministers reported that during private consultations, Elizabeth sometimes seemed to respond to questions they had not yet asked, as if she was perceiving their thoughts directly. Others claimed that she occasionally spoke in languages that no scholar could identify, delivering pronouncements that proved prophetically accurate despite being incomprehensible at the time they were made. The supernatural aspects of Elizabeth's reign reached their peak during the succession crisis of 1753, when rival claimants to the throne threatened to plunge the empire into civil war. Traditional diplomatic and military solutions proved inadequate to resolve the complex web of competing loyalties and foreign interests that threatened Russian stability. Elizabeth retreated once again to her private chambers, emerging after a week of isolation, with a plan so complex and counterintuitive that her advisors initially dismissed it as the product of supernatural madness rather than divine inspiration. The plan required simultaneous military, diplomatic, and economic actions that seemed designed to benefit Elizabeth's enemies rather than consolidate her power. She ordered Russian forces to withdraw from strategic positions, offered territorial concessions that appeared to weaken the empire, and made financial commitments that seemed likely to bankrupt the royal treasury. Her advisors pleaded with her to reconsider, warning that such actions would lead to her overthrow and the empire's collapse. Elizabeth's response was to expose her marked shoulder and declare that the plan had come to her through dreams where the mark itself had spoken, revealing strategies that existed beyond normal human logic. She insisted that her advisors implement every detail exactly as she specified, regardless of how counterproductive the actions might appear. Faced with their empress's supernatural confidence and her track record of impossible successes, her government reluctantly complied with orders that seemed designed to destroy everything they had worked to build. The results unfolded over the following months like a masterpiece of political theatre, written by an intelligence that could perceive patterns invisible to mortal minds. Each apparently self-destructive action triggered reactions from Elizabeth's enemies that ultimately served her interests. Territorial concessions lured rival claimants into overextending their positions. Military withdrawals created power vacuums that her enemies filled in ways that made them vulnerable to counterattack. Financial commitments that seemed ruinous instead created economic dependencies that gave Elizabeth unprecedented leverage over foreign courts. The culmination came when Elizabeth's principal rival, who had been maneuvering for months to claim the throne, suddenly found himself isolated, bankrupt, and facing rebellion from his own supporters. Every move he had made in response to Elizabeth's apparently foolish concessions had ultimately strengthened her position while weakening his own. When he finally recognized the trap that had been constructed around him through seemingly beneficial gifts, he was so thoroughly outmaneuvered that surrender became his only option. The succession crisis ended, not with the bloody civil war that everyone had expected, but with Elizabeth's rivals voluntarily acknowledging her supreme authority and begging for the privilege of serving in her government. The plan that had initially appeared to be supernatural madness revealed itself as strategic brilliance that operated on a level beyond normal human comprehension. Elizabeth's mark, which had glowed with unusual intensity throughout the crisis, finally dimmed to its normal appearance as the empire achieved a stability that would endure for generations. The supernatural success of Elizabeth's seemingly impossible strategy established her reputation as something beyond a normal monarch. Foreign courts began to treat her not just as a political ally or enemy, but as a force of nature that required entirely new forms of diplomatic engagement. Traditional concepts of negotiation and compromise seemed inadequate when dealing with a ruler who appeared to perceive political realities that remained invisible to normal human consciousness. Elizabeth's court became a pilgrimage destination for scholars and mystics seeking to understand the nature of supernatural authority. Philosophers traveled from across Europe, hoping to observe the marked empress and develop new theories about the relationship between divine will and temporal power. Religious figures sought audiences, hoping to determine whether Elizabeth's abilities represented a new form of sainthood or something more ambiguous that challenged traditional categories of spiritual authority. The most detailed philosophical analysis came from Voltaire, who spent several months at Elizabeth's court in 1755 and later wrote extensively about his observations. In his private correspondence, he described Elizabeth as representing a form of human potential that transcended normal limitations without necessarily involving supernatural intervention. He theorized that her mark might serve as a focus for natural abilities that existed within all humans, but were typically suppressed by social conditioning and rational prejudice. According to Voltaire's analysis, Elizabeth's childhood isolation and supernatural stigmatization had freed her from normal social constraints and allowed her to develop intuitive capabilities that were naturally present but culturally suppressed in most individuals. Her apparent supernatural powers might actually represent the full flowering of human potential when liberated from conventional limitations. The mark itself might serve not as a conduit for otherworldly forces, but as a constant reminder that she existed outside normal social categories, and therefore had access to perspectives unavailable to more conventional rulers. This naturalistic interpretation gained support from Elizabeth's own statements about her abilities. In rare moments of personal revelation, she described her decision-making process not as receiving supernatural guidance, but as perceiving patterns and connections that became visible when she abandoned conventional assumptions about what was possible. She claimed that her mark served primarily as a reminder to trust insights that seemed to contradict normal logic, encouraging her to act on perceptions that more conventional rulers would dismiss as impossible fantasies. Whether Elizabeth's abilities sprang from supernatural sources or represented natural human potential, developed to unprecedented levels, their practical effects on the Russian Empire were undeniable. Under her rule, Russia achieved a level of prosperity, stability and international influence that would not be matched for centuries. Her government implemented policies that seemed to anticipate social and economic trends decades before they became apparent to other observers. Russian military forces achieved victories that defied strategic logic and natural law, with such consistency that enemy commanders began to assume that conventional tactics were useless against Elizabeth's apparently supernatural insights. The cultural renaissance that occurred during Elizabeth's reign reflected the same otherworldly quality that characterized her political achievements. Artists and writers produced works that seemed to capture something transcendent about human experience, as if proximity to the marked empress had opened their perception to realities normally hidden from conscious awareness. Architecture from this period exhibits a sense of proportion and harmony that suggests access to mathematical and aesthetic principles that remained undiscovered by formal science. Music composed for Elizabeth's court possessed an emotional depth and complexity that contemporary composers struggled to analyze or replicate. Musicians reported that performing in the Empress's presence inspired them to discover harmonies and rhythms that seemed to emerge from some source beyond conscious creativity. The most accomplished performers claimed that Elizabeth's mark would pulse with visible light when they achieved particularly transcendent musical moments, as if her supernatural nature was responding to art that touched divine frequencies. The literature produced during Elizabeth's reign exhibited similar qualities of inspired insight that transcended normal creative boundaries. Poets wrote verses that seemed to prophesy future events with uncanny accuracy. Novelists created characters whose psychological complexity reflected understanding of human nature that anticipates discoveries in psychology that would not be made for centuries. Even government documents from this period demonstrate a clarity of thought and expression that suggests access to forms of knowledge normally hidden from political discourse. Elizabeth herself became increasingly mysterious and otherworldly as her reign progressed. Courtiers reported that she sometimes seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, conducting audiences in different parts of the palace at times when physical presence in both places should have been impossible. Her appearance began to exhibit subtle but unmistakable signs of transcendence, with skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and eyes that reflected depths of knowledge that appeared to encompass more than any mortal consciousness could contain. The most extraordinary manifestation of Elizabeth's evolving supernatural nature occurred during the eclipse of 1758, when she announced that she would demonstrate the true extent of her otherworldly connection. As the shadow of the moon began to cover the sun, Elizabeth appeared on the palace balcony wearing a gown that fully exposed her marked shoulder. As darkness fell across the landscape, her mark began to glow with increasing intensity, eventually becoming bright enough to illuminate the gathered crowd. Witnesses described the experience as transcendent and terrifying in equal measure. As Elizabeth's mark blazed with supernatural fire, the assembled courtiers claimed to perceive visions of Russia's future that proved prophetically accurate in subsequent years. Some saw military victories that would not occur for decades. Others witnessed technological advances that seemed impossible given the current state of science. A few reported perceiving the deaths of individuals who would not die for years, along with details about their final moments that proved uncannily accurate when those prophecies eventually came to pass. Elizabeth herself seemed to be transformed by whatever force was flowing through her during the eclipse. Observers reported that her voice took on harmonics that resonated at frequencies beyond normal human speech, and her words seemed to carry meanings that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to something deeper than conscious thought. When she spoke about Russia's destiny, listeners claimed to feel the truth of her pronouncements in their bones, as if her supernatural authority was communicating through channels that transcended normal sensory perception. The eclipse demonstration established Elizabeth as something beyond even the most extraordinary monarch. She had evolved from a marked child into a crowned ruler, into something approaching a living embodiment of imperial destiny. The mark that had defined her existence had become a window into realities that existed beyond normal human comprehension, transforming her into a bridge between the mortal and eternal realms. As Elizabeth's reign entered its final phase, the supernatural aspects of her authority became increasingly apparent to even the most skeptical observers. Her ability to anticipate events, manipulate complex political situations, and inspire transcendent loyalty seemed to operate through mechanisms that defied rational explanation. The Russian Empire, under her rule, achieved a harmony between temporal power and spiritual authority that represented something unprecedented in human history. The child who had been born with the devil's mark had become the empress who ruled with supernatural wisdom, proving that the line between curse and blessing might be thinner than anyone dared imagine. Her legacy would endure as testament to the transformative power of embracing, rather than hiding what makes us different, even when that difference carries the weight of supernatural mystery and divine paradox. Elizabeth's mark began as a curse, but ended as her crown. She turned fear into power, prophecy into policy, and superstition into empire. Her rule wasn't just legendary, it felt unearthly. Some say it was the devil's gift, others a test from God. But one truth remained. She was unstoppable. If her story shook your beliefs, like this video, subscribe. For more rulers born with destinies inked into their flesh, and comment what you think her mark really meant.